Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining and your patience as we continue to permit people into the room. I couldn't help but break the silence as we wait here quietly.
Sarah Kimberly says that thank you for breaking the silence.
Yes, I know we should have. I wonder if we could pipe in music. I find that does tend to disrupt the internet connection when I've tried to do it from my computer. So I don't know, maybe with somebody with very strong internet can figure that out. But
okay, I think we have everyone in. Okay.
All right, Ashley, are we just jumping in? Okay. Sam, did you want to address this?
Sure. So we just wanted to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. ASU, NAU, and U of A all have slightly different versions of based on location of what they say for land acknowledgement. As an ASU employee, I'm going to go ahead and read the ASU land acknowledgement. The Arizona State University acknowledges that 23 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Acamel Odom, Impima, and Peepaw Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. ASU acknowledges the sovereignty of these nations and seeks to foster an environment of success and possibility for Native American students and patrons. We're advocates for the incorporation of indigenous knowledge systems and research methodologies. Okay.
Thanks, Sam. And welcome again, everyone, to Budgeting and Spending 101. Jump right into introductions. And we will start by saying this is targeted towards those research administrators that are building basic budgets and that are interested in possibly refreshing themselves on basic budgeting and spending.
Okay, and I am Sam Munguia. I'm an assistant director of research advancement for W.P. Carey School of Business here at Arizona State University. I have been involved in grant writing, pre-award, post-award for the last 18 years. I have worked for both U of A and ASU. Most recently, I was part of the Central Office of Sponsored Projects here at ASU with the fiscal oversight team, where I focus on expenditure monitoring. Having done a little bit of pre-award, post-award, and grant writing, my favorite thing to do is post-award.
And I'm Sarah Gates. I'm the pre-award manager for the Office of Research and Sponsored Projects Administration here at ASU. I say here, we're all virtual. I am personally at home, but I work at ASU. I went with the proposals and negotiation team, and our group's responsible for reviewing and authorizing and submitting proposals for the university. I have been working at ASU for most of my professional life, and it is mainly in pre-award. So in contrast to Sam's interest, I would say my preference is pre-award. And you will see that built out throughout the presentation.
Okay, so one thing that we did want to let everybody know is that today's session was adapted from a 90-minute budgeting seminar we'd hosted at the last TURAC that we had. We do believe there's a lot of really good information in those original slides that have been updated. And we really do want people to have access to that resource. The only thing is that, for time purposes, we will not be going in depth through every single slide that we have, but rather we will make those available after the TURAC concludes at the end of the week. And also, if you see a slide that has a lot of information, might be very dense, just there is no expectation for you to read or for us to read through the entire thing. Mostly we want to get, the basic concepts and information out there.
Indeed. And of course, our session objectives, which you are likely familiar with if you have registered for this course. What we have added since the last conference is, again, some additional information as it relates to the post-award side, the spending, right, part of this presentation. So it should be a pretty well-rounded one, if not entirely rapid and dense, as Sam just said.
And so one thing that I like to do with some presentations that have a lot of information, especially when it's a more basic seminar, I did want to provide like the 3 key takeaways that I would like people to walk away from the session with. And one of the things that I really like to highlight and used to highlight a lot when I was still with central office is that pre-award and post-award actually have a lot in common, and there is a lot of overlap. I know that depending on your department, your university, we might have a lot of people who exclusively do pre-award or exclusively do post-award, but you know, at the end of the day, there is a lot of overlap, especially when it comes to the money. So both pre-award and post-award are both guided by cost principles and are the applicable policies. You cannot, you know, do budgeting without knowing cost principles. You cannot do post-award without knowing those principles. Same thing applies to any institutional policies and uniform guidance. The other thing that you should walk away knowing is that the scope of the project is what determines the size of the budget. And also that you should know that you should ask for what you need. And the reason why I included those last 2 items on here is that we often see, especially with PIs who are earlier in the research career, if they are applying for an opportunity that has a budget ceiling, they'll have a very hard time staying under budget. That is a great indicator that the scope of the project might be too expansive for the opportunity. And obviously, ultimately, is the PI who decides, but those are good conversations and questions to be asking from your PI. And lastly, asking for what you need, again, basing our budgets on scope. We frequently see people not included everything that they need at proposal time, and that's what causes a lot of issues on the execution of the project post-award.
Right. So if that wasn't made clear enough, we'll go into some more information as to why proposal budgets matter, right? I mean, most significantly because they are going to end up significantly impacting the resulting award. But let's get into the very beginnings here. So the budget and budget justification are the PI's opportunity to tell the sponsor what resources the research requires, as well as the costs and the timelines associated with those resources. Every sponsor wants to know that their money is being spent wisely, so the applicant really should make a strong case for each item in their budget. Poor budgets, you know, can result in a variety of delays, and of course can really poorly impact the award, right? You can result in under budgeting, right? Even more significantly, if you have a bad proposal budget, it could be returned without review. So there are consequences to having a budget that either is not really well explained or doesn't align with the goals that the sponsor has in place. So sponsored projects, whether they are funded by the feds, state or local government or various other types of sponsors, generally will operate under these guiding cost principles. There are a host of governing policies, beginning with the federal laws and policies and ending with institutional policies. To protect institutional eligibility for external funding, our institutions must comply with all programmatic, regulatory, fiscal, and property stewardship policies from the federal level all the way down to the institution. The institution, as is noted here, will always follow the most restrictive policy. And again, this is to protect the institution's eligibility for external funding. So uniform guidance, it applies to federal funding and, of grants and cooperative agreements, but it is also the default guidance for many institutions. That is, there's no specific or clear guidance from the sponsor or institution, it'll default to uniform guidance. Note that federally funding contracts use the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR, which we actually do go into a little bit in 201. So the 4 guiding cost principles of all research proposal budgets are allowability, reasonability, allocability, and consistency. These principles can be broadly used to determine whether the proposed costs are appropriate and specific for the project. So let's jump into first steps here. And number 1 with the bullet is reading that solicitation, right? This is the specific funding opportunity and it's your first and best source for information. You will no doubt go back to it several times during the course of proposal development. But for budgeting purposes, here are the few things that you'll want to specifically pay attention to. And I'll take this opportunity to also say there are sometimes with the federal agencies in particular, even broader guiding policies like the PA-PPG, for instance, those will also have some budgetary restrictions and limitations or constraints. So again, make sure that you are checking those in tandem. So the activity type of the project is important to determine at the beginning of the proposal process because it will impact the budget. Each activity type has an assigned facilities and administrative rate, which we'll discuss later in this presentation. And while projects may have elements that go across activity types, the one that is assigned will be for the preponderance of activity involved. And again, this is something that you'll work with the PI and the proposed scope of work. Sometimes it's even identified in the funding announcement. And on and off campus, again, extremely important to determine at the beginning because of the significance in the budget. It will have different F&A implications. And here you can see our institutions actually have slightly varied applications of the on and off campus rate. Well, I shouldn't say applications, I should say determinations. So the PI is your best source for this information detailed here. They know the project, obviously. They should have an idea of the resources that are going to be needed. Your responsibility as an RA is to help them determine the correct categories, right? And the calculations for what the research needs to ensure a compliant and complete budget. And timeline. What we're talking here is not the period of performance or the project period, but rather the timeline that you need as a research administrator to actually prepare this information, the budget itself. You want to work on the budget with the PI in tandem, right, with as they are working on the technical portion. So we recommend that at least a month prior to deadline that you have that solicitation available, right, to thoroughly review, that you have a project period so that you know how long this project will be budgeted for, and that you know of any anticipated subcontractors because you need to reach out them pretty quickly. You want to provide them with the same time, right, that you have permitted so that they can put together their best budget as well. Your own sponsored projects office will dictate the required lead time for institutional review. At ASU, it's 3 business days, which means that the budget should be final with at least 5 business days for the RA to essentially, review, make any revisions to format, and of course, input it into the proposal delivery system that you're working with. All right, now we get to the budgeting. So sponsored project budgets consist of direct costs, which are those that are specifically identifiable to the project, and then facilities and administrative costs, or F&A, and those that can't be readily identifiable to the project. F&A costs are recovered as a specific percentage, and applied to a cost base, which we will talk about further on in the presentation. So just a note, and you'll hear this a few times, that institutions, each of us and other universities across the nation, of course, have different policies and practices for handling certain direct costs, and as was illustrated, F&A cost categories. Just make sure you familiarize yourself with them. In fact, that could be probably wedged right in there into getting started, right? That you familiarize yourself with the solicitation, but also make sure that you know what your institutional policies are, because oftentimes you will have to rely on those to fill in the gaps of information that the FOA doesn't cover. All right, so we'll talk about personnel because that's a big one and found in nearly all proposal budgets, right? These are the people working on the proposed project. It'll include information on the role and often the salary or wages of each individual required to complete the project's objectives. Only your institution's personnel should be included in this section. And of course, if an individual is necessary for a sponsored project and the sponsor allows you to charge their effort to the project, you should budget them at their current institutional salary in accordance with their actual effort on the project. Whenever possible, and unless expressly prohibited by the sponsor, most institutions recommend an escalation factor for both salaries and ERE. 3 to 5% is normal, and that's to cover salary adjustments and fluctuations in ERE. Note, and this may have come to mind rather, as I was talking about applying the institutional rate, There are sponsor-specific guidance on compensation, NIH's salary cap, for instance, which limits to the executive level 2 of the federal executive pay scale, or for instance, NSF's restriction on the number of months that can be budgeted for regular salary or charged to the project. Again, just be sure to review sponsors' policy. You may also find that they do have published restrictions on escalation. The effort can be shown as a percentage of effort of the project here, as a representation of person months, whether it be academic, summer, or calendar, or in some cases even person hours. So your institution will have a preferred or best practice method for that, but often the sponsors will dictate either directly in their funding announcement or by virtue of their formatted budget. And then we'll get to this just momentarily, but all 3 institutions define fringe benefits as direct costs, but they do negotiate and apply the ERE or employee-related expenses differently. And then finally, tuition. That may be budgeted as a fringe benefit or as an other direct cost, depending on the institution. It's determined by the GRA's effort on the project and is generally escalated each year to accommodate increases. And again, your institution should have guidance on how to best apply this. So as was mentioned, there are different ways to calculate ERE, right? And we'll get into this, but as long as they're applied consistently, they are permissible. And it's also a nice example just how similar we all are as institutions, but there are distinctions among the ways in which we apply our policies. And fringe rates are generally negotiated year to year.
Okay, and one other disclaimer about, so I'll try to do post-award implications after every category, budget category that Sarah talks about. But one thing that I did want to highlight is that there is no expectation ever from any RA to know every single policy about everything that happens at a university, because that's absolutely ridiculous and too much. But I think that one good way to approach knowing and learning a lot about what to expect at proposal time so you can better prepare post-award is definitely learning to ask the right questions from faculty. Because a lot of the times you get a lot more information than they're willing to give if you ask questions. So best practice when you're working on those proposal budgets, ask questions because that you can get a lot of information that can save you a lot of pain during post-award. When it becomes particularly important when budgeting for personnel cost. For example, one of the things that sometimes we don't address pre-award include dealing with PIs or senior key personnel that have a fiscal appointment, but also have an administrative appointment within the institution. A lot of faculty across all 3 universities will normally be on a 9-month academic appointment and are able to receive summer pay from grants. However, this is if they are people who are on a calendar 12-month appointment, they might require additional levels of approvals, like here at ASU. Deans, department chairs will require provost approval in order to get compensation from a grant. It also might mean that the institutional base salary could potentially change during the period of performance, and especially if those administrative appointments are temporary. So if they're only serving as chair for their department for 2 years, and their salary is $300,000, at the end of that appointment, that salary might revert to $200,000 or something like that. So those are good conversations and questions to ask. Obviously, it's a lot easier to have those conversations for department level RAs than it is for centralized units. But again, those are good things to keep in mind as we ask more questions and get to know our faculty a little bit better. The other item that sometimes can affect post-award that might not necessarily get addressed at pre-award time is whenever you have a faculty member who has a planned sabbatical. It can have an impact on, again, the amount of compensation they can receive from the grant, or even their ability to serve as a PI on the project. So when you are working with faculty on developing that list of personnel, making sure that you are asking some questions. The other thing that we see frequently, especially with faculty that have a large research group, is that they will have graduate research assistants that are about to graduate or 1 year away from graduation, and there is an expectation that they will stay on the project as something else. For example, a postdoctoral associate. So it is good to ask those questions in terms of how long somebody will be involved in the project and if there is going to be a change in their affiliation with the institution, because this can mean change in institutional base salary, FTE, ERE, and ultimately, for example, if there is a postdoc that is going to be working on the project later on, it can also change the requirements of documents that you need to include with your proposal. The other item that is also good to bring up during the proposal time that has an impact on post-award is those to be named versus to be hired positions. A lot of the times, faculty, we can try and teach them correct language for a lot of these things. They'll, interpret things however they want to. But they are like, hey, it's a TBD position. What does that mean? Are we going to hire somebody brand new position? Is it going to be a full-time position? Are we going to use somebody who's already at the institution? And again, it has a lot of impact in terms of institutional base salaries as well as the ERE. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is making sure that we have enough money to do what we said we were going to do. And a lot of this, information, if it's not addressed pre-award, it ends up costing a lot more post-award. Next slide. And then the other, source of hidden costs when it comes to personnel costs is actually recruitment cost. A lot of frequently pre-award, we do focus a lot on the salary and the branch benefits and that we include in the budget. But for some types of projects, whether they're large scale center proposals or maybe they have a foreign component, there might be the need to recruit a specialized position, whether it's a program director or a PhD, a doctoral student, a postdoc or something, somebody who is not the standard person you would normally recruit. So for those types of positions, a lot of the times post-award, we have to cover other costs that were not included in the proposal budget. And the most frequent costs that we see are background checks, relocation costs, short-term visas, as well as the use of using advertising agencies and other employment agencies. And one thing to know is that these costs are absolutely allowable to include in your proposal. And they're allowed to be charged on the grant post-award per uniform guidance, as long as your process is consistent with what your institution does for regular recruitment, then those and their reasonable cost, then it should be fine and you should be able to include them. Again, this is particularly important for whenever you have a large, tier 1, tier 2 type of proposal or project.
Capital equipment. This is not terribly uncommon, right, for sponsored projects. It is included when it is necessary for the project. The $5,000 acquisition cost refers to a single item in this case. For example, if you had 3 laptops that were $2,000 each, the collective $6,000 cost of that would not be capital equipment, right? Because those are individual items with a cost of less than $5,000. Those would be materials and supplies. We are going to speak more on fabricated equipment in 201. So just be aware that there are different thresholds and guidance for fabricated equipment, software, and other categories of capital expenditures. Again, this one has significant implications because of its impact on F&A.
Okay, and so one thing that I did want to address when it comes to capital equipment is that there has been always again, I do want to make sure people know you should be able to ask for what you need. And so I think standard practice at proposal time for the longest time was, you should only be requesting capital purchases if the equipment is not available at your institution. However, the fact that an institution has a piece of equipment you need doesn't necessarily mean that you have access to it or that you will have access to it in a timely manner for you to stick to your timeline. So again, the proposal time is when you ask for what you need and you justify any type of exception. So if you have the need to purchase equipment for a project because your institution has years wait to use a particular laser, or there's all these challenges that would hinder the progress of the project, then absolutely.
Sorry about that.
And I'm like, Sarah, I have a question. Yeah, so again, at proposal time, if you do have the need to buy equipment that's already available at your institution, you can absolutely request it, but making sure that you justify why there is a need for that purchase if there is equipment available. I mean, existing equipment at the institution. I shouldn't say available because maybe it's not. And that is also something you should include with your transaction as you purchase capital equipment, making sure that that transaction stands on its own. The other best practice when it comes to capital purchases includes making sure that we're naming vendors at proposal time. Most as state agencies, all of the universities, we have procurement policies, and having to go out to bid to buy something can be very complicated. So if your PI already knows which vendor they want to use to buy that particular piece of equipment, making sure we include that at proposal time, and that will become your backup documentation for when you actually make that purchase post-award. Lastly, about capital equipment, one thing, I would highly recommend a pre-award time that you get a quote before you budget. A lot of the times, faculty will give you a quote based just on the unit price of the equipment, but they will neglect to tell you how much freight is going to be, sales tax, use tax, installation, and all of those costs will still need to be paid post-award. So making sure that, we are including all of those costs at proposal time.
All right, so the federal government, the state of Arizona, and each institution may have separate travel policies, and generally the most restrictive policy will apply. Lodging rates are determined based on destination and season, and for per diem, the individual meals are designated with a specific percentage. That's to make it easier essentially to calculate when you've got a portion of your day covered by, let's say, a conference, right, a serving lunch and so forth. Also, departure and return days are generally reimbursed at 75% of the full day. Transportation can include airfare. It's often the case, right, with conference travel, or if you're going to program meetings in DC. Sometimes you have rental car fees or taxis or shuttles from the airport, right? Or sometimes if there's on-site work, let's say in-state or close by, you'll have mileage reimbursement. Foreign travel is importantly budgeted and justified separately from domestic travel. There is a U.S. flag carrier requirement for federal funding, so do make sure that you're looking into that should you have foreign travel proposed as part of your budget. And then additional costs are also in play for foreign travel, which Sam does get into here momentarily, but they include like registry fees or visa costs. It's particularly important to capture these costs, not only to remain in budget, but also because sponsors may often or may require rather prior authorization for foreign travel. So you want to get it approved as part of your proposal budget.
Okay, am I muted now? So for post-award implications, I think the biggest challenge we see is whenever we have foreign travel. As a reminder, foreign travel is what we consider to be a restricted category. So if you did not include it at proposal time, most likely you would need, prior approval in order to pay for international travel cost. One thing that we frequently see in post-award again is those hidden costs that we did not include at proposal time. So passport fees, travel visas, vaccinations, and also making sure that we're showing that travel is necessary for the project, not necessarily just as a means of professional development for project personnel. The other thing, again, ask for what you need. I used to help out with an international project where, they wanted disposable SIM cards when they traveled. And so they could use a cell phone while they were abroad. And so it became like an entire discussion. Eventually, the sponsor agreed that it was okay, that it complied with uniform guidance. But it is one of those expenses that if you think you're going to need it, it is so much better to include it at proposal time. That way, there is no back and forth. There is not even, much of a discussion post award. And then just a reminder, per uniform guidance, basically we are allowed to charge as travel anything and any expense, most expenses that an employee incurs as a result of their travel status. That is why we're allowed able to do passport fees and travel visas. Like it is always beyond just lodging and airfare. But again, if there are quirky things that you might need while traveling abroad, like maybe you need laundry services or something like that. If there is something that's going to be impactful post award, making sure that we're asking for those things at proposal time.
All right, participant support. This is budgeted in 4 subcategories: stipends, travel, subsistence, and other. If the primary purpose of the individual's participation is learning and receiving training as a participant, then the cost may qualify as participant support. But if the individual is speaking or assisting with the management of training, then such costs do not qualify as participant support. Similarly, if project personnel are providing services or producing deliverables, also not eligible to receive participant support. And of course, there are a couple of critical distinctions here. This one has some nuance, right, in determining what applies appropriately for participant support. It is different from honoraria, payment to non-institution guest speakers or participation in an advisory board. It's also not to be confused with human subject pay. Those are incentives to provide for people to provide information either in the form of surveys or interviews, and are often called participants. So do make sure that you are making that distinction with your PI and budgeting accordingly, again, because it has implications on the F&A recovery.
Okay, and so I will also second what Sarah said. Language is so important, and as much as we are able, teaching our faculty to use the right terminology can save a lot of headaches. When I was still part of fiscal oversight doing expenditure monitoring, I could say that this is the confusion between participant support and human subjects was one of like my bread and butter questions that I addressed all the time. So making sure that we are, sharing right terminology with PIs, making sure that we're sharing actual definitions, making sure that whenever we are talking to them about participant support, we're only using participant support for actual participants. Same thing with human subject pay. And as a reminder, human subject pay does impact, they have an impact. And so one thing that we highly has an impact on post award is, I did have a faculty member once that worked with somebody who budgeted everything as participant support on a National Science Foundation grant. And because participant support is what is considered restricted category, they were not able to use that money at all, as NSF did not allow the rebudget of that. And also, even if they do allow it, like I said, I personally have never seen NSF say yes to rebudgeting out of participant support. So maybe this would have been a good poll question to see if anybody else has ever seen it. In 18 years, I've never seen it. But making sure that we absolutely are using the correct terminology. And again, participant support not only has those F&A implications, but also it could indicate to the sponsor that there is a change in scope of work. And the reason being is if you are proposing a project that has, participant support, which by definition is somebody who's there to benefit themselves, not to benefit the project, it presents a project that is focused on providing something for students or for the participants. If we change that to salary, it takes away that component. So maybe your proposal would not have been reviewed the same way if it had been originally marked as something else. So there is always that danger of like when we're not using the terminology correctly. So again, participant support, different than human subjects. Let's teach our PIs how to use the right terms.
Yes, a lot of this is about education, right? Okay, so we've arrived at the rest, which we will go into a little bit more in 201, but essentially everything that wasn't previously covered here in those past slides will end up in other direct costs. And here are some of the more common items.
Okay, I know. I'm still talking about human subject pay and participant support. It is important. It happens a lot. But one thing, that we need to be very mindful at pre-award time when we're talking about human subject pay is that a lot of the times faculty, might get a little bit eager and they're like, oh my God, let's give people AirPods and let's give people iPads. So even when there is non-compensatory, human subject pay, non-monetary, there are tax implications for people who receive human subject pay. The other thing I wanted to bring up, because this is kind of new to me, my college now does a lot of USDA, which was not my bread and butter before, but now it is. And so one thing that USDA denotes in their guidance is that they do not allow incentives. And so for them, the word incentive implies that we are, actively trying to persuade people to act one way or the other during their participation in the research study. So, but they do allow research subject pay. So for me, I know USDA is the one that has this particular distinction in their guidance, but now I have adopted it regardless of who the sponsor is. So again, we do want to be very clear with that language. It's like we're not necessarily giving money to change people's minds as they participate in this in the study. What we're trying to do is, reimburse them for the time they're spending helping out with the project. So, some food for thought on that one. And then for other direct costs, again, going back to procurement policies and, how sometimes we need to do bids and things like that. Obviously we do have the option to do sole source justifications to forego the bidding process, but it is a lot easier to get those exceptions approved if you have the good backup documentation. So if you at proposal time already know that you have a particular vendor you want to work with, there's a particular consultant that wants to be involved in the project, putting those specific names in your budget justification will absolutely help things move a lot faster on the post-award side.
And here we are talking a little bit more about consultants. In this case, versus vendors versus subrecipients, not a showdown, but rather an illustration of the distinction between the three. Again, very important to make sure you know what your collaborators are doing, how they are participating in the project. What's significant here is that the subawards are performing a substantial portion of the programmatic effort, right? They've got an impact and influence on it. The funds are going to be passed through to them. And I think most importantly, the sponsor compliance, the policies are going to flow down to them too, which is important, right? Because of their impact on the programmatic outcome. Vendors and consultants, on the other hand, those are specified products or services, right? Or expertise in the form of consultants, and they do not design or develop the research, right? They are providing something that they would normally otherwise be paid for. It's not influenced by the specific project itself. And, for all the reasons that Sam has just covered, we are looking at, again, F&A implications, right? Because the subawards are included in our modified total direct cost base, which is that we use with our negotiated rate often. And for subawards, we only include up to the first 25,000 for each. All right, and I have a feeling we are going to be moving pretty quickly through the end here as we're nearing the 50 minutes. But cost share, right? Big one. Anything that is budgeted, or I should say, anything that's not budgeted, any portion of the project that's not funded by the sponsor, but's required to complete the project is going to be cost share. So it should only really be included if it's mandated by the sponsor, and it needs to be documented and tracked if it is in fact specifically committed.
So for cost share, I feel like the proposal time, the approval and review of cost share is very different. I know here at ASU, we are very flexible. When I was at the U of A, it wasn't super flexible. So you had very, strong, firm commitments at proposal time that followed the project into post-award. But just to avoid any issues, making sure that we have some best practices when it comes to cost share. First and foremost, whenever possible, we should be focusing on authoring up what is considered in-kind cost share. So those are costs that your institution would have incurred regardless of the outcome of the proposal. So whether it's a PI salary or a grad student salary in ERE, those are things that would have the university would have continued to pay even if the proposal does not get funded. So those are like salary, ERE, and FNA associated with those. That should always be, whenever possible, your the default source of your cost share. If there is a requirement from the sponsor that it has to be a cash contribution, otherwise what is known as a new cost to the university, making sure that those funding sources are identified at proposal time, because we do see that a lot of post-award, that it's really easy at proposal time to be like, of course, I'm going to pay $30,000 in new cash, to buy 5 computers, and then people don't know where the money's coming from. So making sure that avoid cash unless it's required by the sponsor, making sure that all the funding sources are clearly identified at proposal time. And is this me?
It is, if you'd like to take it away.
So this one is interesting because I feel like it's going to be different from what was talked about last time. So research is extremely expensive, and FNA costs are under recovered. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we are charging indirect costs or FNA on a sponsored project, we're not pre-charging for expenses that are going to happen, during the duration of the project. This is the university recovering costs that they have already paid over the years. Also, and FNA, they do limit how much we can recover from administrative expenses. So we're always charging an FNA rate that is less than our actual expenditures on facilities and administrative cost. So it's important to keep that in mind. And I know that, a lot of faculty feel very strongly about FNA, but, just as research administrators, we do understand that these costs, are real and they're more expensive than we're actually charging sponsors for. Next slide, please. So this is like the famous little graphic about what are some of the things that are covered by facilities and administrative cost. So it includes depreciation, office supplies, clerical time, utilities, data storage, and things like that. The main, characteristic about things that we associate with FNA costs are things that cannot be easily tied to a specific project. So that's why a lot of people call it overhead. But again, times are changing and research keeps getting more expensive. So can we move to the next slide? So one thing is that and I feel like I've been doing proposals for a while where it was basically, unheard of to include in your proposal budgets, things that should have been covered by FNA. Office supplies, internet, postage, administrative and clerical salaries. That is with how expensive things are, I have to bring it back to saying, ask for what you need. A lot of the times, faculty do want to make the project seem more appealing to funders by making it look cheap. when it really costs money. But if you do have a project, a proposal time where you need, you need office supplies and you need clerical salaries, include that at proposal time. And one of the examples that we used to talk about is like, okay, your department might pay for postage like couple $100 a year, but if you have to do mailers for surveys for 5,000 human subjects, that cost is significantly a lot more. So it's more than your FNA recovery can sustain. So again, it's like, yes, we support FNA, but at the same time, sometimes we do have to directly charge things to a project. And as long as you justify it at proposal time, it should make for smooth sailing and post award.
Yes, and our FNA rates are developed and captured as part of our negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. And as the name suggests, institutions negotiate these rates with their federal cognizant agency, which is the Department of Health and Human Services for each of us. Not captured here are industry and charitable rates, which we'll talk about a little bit in 201. And because we are in our last 5 minutes, I'll actually take this as a nice transition to address Alexis's question, which is, what is the difference between on-campus organized research and on-campus instruction? And really there, the difference is the organized research versus instruction. And that's an activity type, right? Based on the project that's being performed, on the scope of work. Your own institution will likely have guidance on, and in fact, maybe even examples. This is the case with ASU. We have kind of a list of examples to help you better determine which activity type is appropriate, and therefore which is the appropriate FNA rate. And then somewhat separate from that is whether it is on or off campus, right? So it can be on or off campus organized research or on or off campus instruction. And those rates, again, are different. Sam mentioned we are limited in what we can charge for our administrative costs, which is why you see a consistent 26% across the board for things that are off campus, right? All right. We mentioned modified total direct cost base, MTDC. And the exclusions therein. That's the base in which we apply our federally negotiated rate to, unless otherwise specified, right? If we get a limited rate, we will, or I should say most institutions generally will charge against a total direct cost base. You may even see some cases where the sponsor will require that you charge FNA to the total cost. And that requires some math, which we have in our next slide deck, how to calculate unusual FNA rates, because it is a little bit tricky. We talked about exclusions. And again, that's why they're important to make sure that you're calculating and understanding these budget categories correctly, right? Because you will end up under budgeted if you don't do so. Okay, and we have but 1 minute to talk about budget justifications, but here you go. You just want to make sure that you've got it explained in enough detail, right? So that the sponsor knows that it's necessary for the project, essentially, and that it's detailed in such a way that it can be allocated to the project, right, specifically. And of course, here are some best practices. Sam, do you want to squeeze this in?
Yes, and just wanted to say how important the budget justification or budget narrative is post-award, because you attach it to your transaction and you're good to go, especially for anything that might be a highly scrutinized spending category, like subawards, capital purchases, or anything that's an exception to cost accounting standards. And that would be anytime we directly charge to a grant something that should have been covered by FNA. Again, post-award, that a good budget justification is our best friend.
Okay, these links are going to be in the slides that are uploaded, and they serve each of our institutions here. A lot of good information there. And of course, we will have our emails available if you want to catch us afterwards. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.